Rule number 1 of the Han family. Never trust a gift from a dead man. When that black envelope appeared on my desk, I thought it was a threat from the Choi Syndicate. I was wrong. It wasn't a death warrant, it was a birth certificate. And it didn't list 2 sons. It listed 3. If you think you know who stepped out of that elevator, you're playing the wrong game. This isn't a reunion. It's an execution. The rain in Seoul doesn't just fall. It drowns the secrets of the powerful. The lobby of the Shilla was silent enough to hear a heart break. I stood there, my hands still warm from the twins' trembling grip, watching a ghost walk toward me. He had my face. He had my stride. But when he stepped into the light, the amber fire in my eyes met a wall of frozen gray. He didn't say a word. He just held up a black envelope, the twin to the one sitting on my desk upstairs. In that second, the empire I'd built, the blood I'd spilled, and the woman I'd finally found again felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. I looked at Nia. Her face went pale, her eyes darting between us, searching for the man she knew in a sea of identical shadows. "Dune?" she whispered. Both of us turned. Both of us answered. "I'm right here, Nia. The nightmare didn't start 6 years ago in a hotel room in London. Started tonight. Because for the first time in my life, the dragon wasn't the apex predator. I was the prey. And the man holding the pen to my life was me." Before we dive back into the fire and uncover the truth behind those gray eyes, I have to ask you, who do you think is really holding that second envelope? Is it a brother Dune never knew? Or is the past finally catching up to him in the worst way possible? Drop your theories in the comments right now. And while you're there, let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Whether you're in a quiet corner of the city or halfway across the globe, remember that on this channel, we aren't just a creator and a listener. We are a family. If you haven't joined our inner circle yet, hit that subscribe button right now, because we have so many more incredible stories waiting to be told. Now, let's begin. The rain over Seoul had transitioned from a violent downpour into a rhythmic, suffocating drizzle that clung to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of the city's industrial breath. Nia sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against her temples. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Ever since the encounter at the Shilla, the world had felt tilted, as if the ground beneath her feet were made of glass ready to shatter. When the private elevator chimed, the sound echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. Nia jumped, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes darting toward the foyer. The doors slid open with a whisper of precision, and a silhouette stepped out. He was draped in a charcoal overcoat, the shoulders darkened by the damp night air. He moved with that unmistakable predatory grace, the slow, deliberate gait of a man who owned the air he breathed. For a moment, he stayed in the shadows, shedding his coat with a fluid motion that Nia had seen 1,000 times. "Dune?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast room. The man stepped into the warm glow of the amber recessed lighting. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was softer, more present than the one he had worn when he left. He walked toward her, and as the light hit his face, the familiar lines of his jaw and the curve of his brow were perfectly in place. But it was the warmth in his gaze that caught her off guard. It wasn't the usual smoldering intensity of a warrior. It was the gentle light of a man returning home to his sanctuary. "I'm sorry I was gone so long," he said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that vibrated in the small space between them. "The city is restless tonight, but it shouldn't have kept me from you." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his thumb lightly grazed her cheekbone. His skin was warm, startlingly so. Nia leaned into the touch, her eyes closing as a shuddering breath escaped her. The panic that had been clawing at her throat for hours began to recede, replaced by a strange, overwhelming sense of calm. "You look like you've been fighting ghosts," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "But the ghosts are gone, Nia. I've made sure of it." She looked up at him, searching his eyes. In the dim light, the color seemed deep, almost shifting, but the cold gray she had feared seeing was nowhere to be found. He smiled, a small, tilted grin that reached his eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt the tension in her shoulders truly dissolve. The girls, she said, her voice regaining some strength. They wouldn't sleep. They kept asking when the dragon was coming home. Then let's not keep them waiting, he replied. He didn't head toward his office to check the monitors or call Jinho for a status report. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen. Nia watched him, confused. Usually, Dune's return was marked by a flurry of subordinates and the sharp clicking of tablets. But this man moved with a domestic ease that felt both beautiful and hauntingly alien. He pulled a silk apron from the pantry, tying it over his dress shirt with practiced fingers. He began to move through the kitchen with a rhythm that was almost musical. He didn't ask where the ingredients were. He navigated the spice rack and the refrigerator as if he had built them himself. "What are you doing?" Nia asked, standing in the doorway. "The twins told me once that the food in the safe house tasted like gray cardboard," he said, chuckling softly as he began to dice fresh garlic with terrifyingly perfect precision. "I promised them that when we were back, I'd make them the jajangmyeon they saw in that storybook. The one with the extra caramel sauce and the hand-pulled noodles." Nia stood frozen. It was a tiny detail, a passing comment the twins had made weeks ago. Dune had been in the room, but he had been deep in a conversation with his lieutenants about shipping routes in Incheon. She hadn't thought he had heard a word of the children's chatter. Yet here he was, recreating a memory she didn't even know he had captured. As the aroma of toasted black bean paste and sautéed pork began to fill the penthouse, the twins appeared at the top of the stairs. Ayase and Arya stood in their matching silk pajamas, their eyes wide as they peered over the railing. They were hesitant, their small spirits still bruised by the chaos of the last few days. "Daddy," Arya called out, her voice tiny. The man in the kitchen turned, his face lighting up with a radiance that Nia found almost blinding. He knelt on the floor, opening his arms wide. "Who wants to help me with the noodles? I think I might have made too much sauce for just one person." The girls didn't run at first. They walked down the stairs slowly, their eyes fixed on his. But as they reached the bottom, he didn't bark an order or offer a stiff pat on the head. He gathered them both into a crushing embrace, lifting them into the air and spinning them until they giggled. A sound Nia hadn't heard since they were in London. "You smell like the rain," Ayase said, burying her face in his neck. "And you smell like chocolate and mischief," he countered, booping her nose. He set them on the high stools at the kitchen island, giving each a small task. He taught Arya how to stir the sauce without splashing, his large, scarred hand guiding her tiny one with a patience that felt divine. He showed Ayase how to plate the cucumber garnishes, praising her artistic eye with a sincerity that brought a flush of pride to the child's cheeks. Nia watched from the shadows of the living room, a cold shiver running down her spine despite the warmth of the kitchen. It was perfect. It was more than perfect. It was the version of Dune she had dreamed of during those 5 long years of hiding. It was the father she wanted for her daughters. But as he laughed, a deep, resonant sound that filled the hollow spaces of the apartment, she felt a flicker of unease. Dune was a man of shadows and sharp edges. He was a man who took what he wanted and broke what he didn't need. This man was a healer. He was attentive. He noticed the way Nia's hands still shook slightly, and without a word, he poured her a glass of her favorite vintage, placing it near her hand as he passed by to check the noodles. "Drink," he whispered as he passed. "You're safe now. I'm here." They sat down to dinner as a family. The twins talked incessantly, their fear forgotten in the face of this doting, attentive version of their father. He listened to every word, nodding at their stories about the scary man at the hotel as if he were hearing them for the first time, his expression one of deep, protective concern. "He won't ever come back, will he?" Arya asked, her lip trembling slightly as she looked at her bowl. The man reached across the table, taking her small hand in his. His grip was firm, a silent promise of absolute security. "No one will ever hurt you again, not while I have breath in my lungs. You are the daughters of the dragon, and the world will learn to bow to you, not the other way around." After dinner, he insisted on putting them to bed himself. Usually, that was Nia's job while Dune retreated to his study to deal with the blood-soaked business of his empire. But tonight, he led them to their room, tucked them into their beds, and sat between them on the floor. Nia stood in the hallway, the door ajar, watching the scene. He began to tell them a story, Not a story of war or dragons, but a story about a little girl who found a star in a dark forest and carried it home to light her mother's way. His voice was a hypnotic murmur, lulling the children into a deep, peaceful sleep. When he finally emerged from the room, the lights in the hallway were dimmed. He saw Nia standing there, her arms crossed over her chest. He walked toward her, his silhouette dominating the narrow space. "They're finally at peace," he said softly. "You're different tonight," Nia said, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her. He didn't pull away. He didn't look for an excuse to leave. He reached out and cupped her face with both hands, forcing her to look into his eyes. "The man you knew was a man at war," he said, his gaze searching hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "But seeing you again, seeing them, it changed something inside me. I realized that the empire doesn't matter if there's no one to share the throne with. I want to be the man you deserve, Nia, not just the man you needed to survive." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm on her lips. "In London, in that room, I told myself I would find you again. I told myself I would make it right. Tonight is the beginning of that." He kissed her then. It wasn't the desperate, jagged kiss of their reunion. It was slow, deep, and filled with a terrifyingly perfect tenderness. It was a kiss that promised a future, a kiss that felt like home. Nia let herself go. She leaned into him, her heart thudding against her ribs. For a few minutes, the world outside, the gray-eyed twin, the black envelopes, the looming war, all of it vanished. There was only this man, this warmth, and the feeling of finally being cherished. As they eventually pulled apart, he smiled at her. A gentle, reassuring look. "Go to sleep, Nia. I have a few things to finish in the study, but I'll be with you soon." He watched her walk to the master bedroom, his expression unreadable as she disappeared behind the door. The moment the latch clicked shut, the warmth in his face didn't just fade, it evaporated. He turned and walked toward the study, his gait shifting. The domestic ease was gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical efficiency. He entered the room and sat behind the heavy mahogany desk, the same desk where the real Han Du-yoon had sat just hours before. He didn't look at the files on the Choi Syndicate. He didn't look at the security feeds. Instead, he pulled a small, silver kit from his pocket. He laid out a series of thin, medical-grade tools and a small vial of amber-colored liquid. With a steady hand, he picked up a pair of specialized contact lenses. He looked into the vanity mirror on the desk, his gray eyes reflecting the cold moonlight. Slowly, carefully, he placed the amber lenses over his pupils, hiding the gray beneath a mask of fire. He then picked up a small, vibrating tool with a needle-thin tip. He looked at his left hand, specifically at the webbing between his thumb and forefinger. On the desk lay a high-resolution photograph of the real Dune's hand, showing a faint, jagged scar from a knife wound sustained years ago in a back alley in Macau. With a chilling lack of emotion, he began to press the needle into his own flesh, mimicking the pattern of the scar with agonizing precision. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He watched the blood well up, a dark red smear against his pale skin, with the detached curiosity of a scientist. His phone buzzed on the desk. He answered it on the first ring, his voice returning to that perfect, baritone mimicry of his brother. "Is it done?" the voice on the other end asked. A voice that sounded like aged parchment and old blood. The old dragon. "The children are asleep," the man replied, his eyes fixed on his reflection. "The woman is convinced. She thinks the dragon has finally grown a heart." "And the real one?" The man looked at the monitor, which showed a hidden cell in a location miles away. On the screen, the real Han Du-yoon was strapped to a chair, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and agony, his mouth covered by a heavy gag. "He's watching," the twin said, a small, cruel smile finally touching his lips. "He's watching me live his life. He's watching me love his woman. He's watching me raise his daughters. It's a much slower death than a bullet, father." "Good," the old dragon whispered. "Continue the play. By the time he manages to speak a single word, there won't be anyone left who recognizes his voice." The man hung up the phone and went back to his work. He wiped the blood from his hand, the new scar looking perfectly aged under his skilled hands. He stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at the door to the bedroom. He wasn't an assassin. He wasn't a soldier. He was a replacement. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the tracks of the man who had entered the building, leaving behind only a ghost who wore the face of a king. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and in the heart of the dragon's palace, the greatest deception in the history of the Han family had just begun. Nia was sleeping soundly, dreaming of a man who had finally changed for her, never realizing that the man she had kissed was the very person who had come to erase everything she loved. The silence of the penthouse was no longer heavy. It was lethal. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse was pale and clinical, stripped of the warmth that had filled the kitchen the night before. For Isa and Arya, the world had changed shape while they slept. They sat at the massive marble breakfast island, their small legs dangling from the high velvet stools, picking at plates of perfectly sliced fruit. To anyone watching through the security cameras, it was a picture of domestic bliss. Two beautiful children in a sun-drenched sanctuary, looked after by a father who had finally traded his sword for a spatula. But the air in the room felt thin, as if the oxygen were being slowly sucked out of the space by the man standing at the stove. Nia was in the master suite, the sound of the shower humming in the distance, a sound that usually signaled the start of a normal day. But for the twins, nothing was normal. They watched the man they thought was their father. He moved with the same grace, wore the same black silk shirt, and possessed the same sharp jawline that they had seen every day since they were brought to Seoul. Yet, there was a silence about him that felt like the bottom of a deep, dark well. Isa looked at Arya, a silent communication passing between them that only twins understand. Their father, the real dragon, had a specific energy, a restless, vibrating power that felt like a heater left on in a cold room. This man was cold. He was a statue that had learned how to breathe. As the man turned to place 2 glasses of fresh orange juice in front of them, he smiled. It was the same smile from the night before, the one that had made their mother cry with relief. "Eat up, little dragons," he said, his voice a perfect replica of the baritone they loved. "We have a big day. I thought we might go to the park later, just the 4 of us. No guards. No guns. Just family." Arya reached out, her small hand trembling slightly as she touched his sleeve. She remembered the car ride from the airport, the night the world had turned into a blur of rain and sirens. She remembered her father, the real Dune, reaching back from the front seat. He had looked at them with eyes that were terrified for them, but fierce for everyone else. He had taken their small wrists in his large, scarred hands and tapped twice on the inside of their pulses. "If the world gets too loud," he had whispered, his voice thick with a rare emotion, asterisk, "and you aren't sure if it's me or the shadows, I'll give you the signal. 2 taps. Always 2 taps. That means the dragon is home. Asterisk." Arya took a deep breath, her heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached out and placed her fingers on the man's wrist, right where his pulse should have been beneath the silk cuff. She waited, her eyes wide and searching. Then, with the desperate hope of a child trying to wake up from a nightmare, she tapped twice. 1, 2. The man didn't move. He didn't react. He didn't return the pressure. He simply continued to hold the juice glass, his gaze fixed on the horizon of the city outside. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed down on Arya's shoulders. She tapped again, harder this time, her small fingers digging into his skin. 1, 2. The man slowly lowered the glass. He turned his head, his neck moving with a slow, mechanical precision. He looked down at Arya's hand on his wrist, and then he looked into her eyes. The amber contact lenses he wore caught the morning sun, but behind the artificial fire, Arya saw the truth. There was no recognition. There was no love. There was only a vast, empty gray that felt like the edge of a cliff. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out with his other hand and gently, almost delicately, took Arya's hand in his. His skin was warm, but it felt like the heat of a machine, not a human. He leaned in, his shadow falling over both girls, blotting out the morning sun. "That's a funny little game," he whispered. His voice was no longer the warm, comforting melody of the night before. It was a jagged, icy sliver that cut through their bravado. "But we aren't playing games anymore, are we?" Sa reached for her sister, her eyes filling with tears. Where's our daddy? She breathed, the question she had been too afraid to ask since she woke up. The man didn't flinch at the word. He leaned closer, his face inches from theirs. The scent of sandalwood was there, but beneath it smelled something else. Something chemical like a hospital or a grave. He looked from one twin to the other, his expression shifting into something predatory and cold. I am the only father you have now, he said, his voice dropping to a level so low it was almost a growl. And I am going to tell you a secret because little dragons are supposed to be smart. If you go to mommy, if you try to tell her I didn't play your little game, if you say even one word that makes her sad, the dragon never comes back. The girls froze. The threat wasn't about them. It was about the man they loved, the man they were waiting for. Do you understand? He asked, his grip on Arya's hand tightening just enough to be felt, but not enough to leave a mark. I am the only thing keeping the dragon alive. If mommy finds out I'm here instead of him, I'll have to send him away forever. To a place where there are no stars and no stories. To the bottom of the ocean where the dragons go to die. Arya's breath hitched in a sob, but she clamped her hand over her mouth, her eyes darting toward the bedroom door where their mother was. Good, the man whispered, straightening up as the sound of the shower stopped. The mask of the perfect, doting father snapped back into place instantly. He smoothed his hair, adjusted his cuffs, and flashed that bright, artificial smile. Now eat your fruit. We don't want mommy to think you're not happy, do we? Nia emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, looking more rested than she had in months. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by a soft glow of hope. She saw her daughters sitting quietly at the counter and her husband standing by the window, the sun framing his silhouette like a halo. Good morning, she said, walking over to the man and leaning her head against his shoulder. I actually slept. I can't remember the last time I slept through the night. The man wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. He kissed the top of her head with a tenderness that made the twins' stomachs turn. I told you, Nia, you're safe now. Everything is under control. He looked over Nia's shoulder at the girls, his amber eyes locking onto theirs. It was a challenge. Adare. The girls are a little quiet this morning, he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. I think they might be a bit overwhelmed by everything. Maybe they need some quiet time in their room today, just to process. Are you okay, loves? Nia asked, turning toward them, her brow furrowed with motherly instinct. Issei looked at the man. She saw the way his hand was resting on the small of Nia's back, his fingers curled slightly, like a predator ready to strike. She thought of the secret signal and the cold gray eyes hiding behind the amber. She thought of her father at the bottom of a dark ocean. We're just tired, mommy? Issei lied, her voice flat and hollow. Arya nodded frantically, her eyes fixed on her plate. Just tired. Nia sighed, walking over to press a kiss to each of their foreheads. It's been a lot. We'll take it easy today. Maybe we can all watch a movie later. That sounds perfect, the man said. He walked over to the girls, ruffling Arya's hair in a way that made her flinch inwardly, though she forced herself to stay still. I'll go get the theater room ready. Why don't you girls go pick out a film? Something with a happy ending. As he walked out of the room, the atmosphere changed instantly. The heavy, suffocating pressure lifted slightly, but the fear remained, anchored in the twins' hearts. They were no longer in a home. They were in a prison with glass walls, and the jailer was a man who wore their father's face like a stolen garment. For the rest of the morning, the penthouse felt like a stage play. The man Ruin was a master of his craft. He moved through the rooms with an easy familiarity, commenting on the decor, checking the security logs, and speaking to the guards over the intercom with the same authority that Dune always had. He was better at being Dune than Dune was. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't snap at the help. He didn't let the shadows of the underworld darken his brow. He was the idealized version of the dragon, the hero Nia had always wanted him to become. But to the twins, every smile was a sneer, and every touch was a threat. They spent the afternoon huddled together in the corner of their playroom, surrounded by expensive toys they no longer wanted to touch. They spoke in whispers, their heads bent close together. We have to find him, Arya whispered, her voice trembling. The real daddy. He's in the dark place. We can't tell mommy, Issei reminded her, her eyes darting toward the door. He said he'd hurt him. He said the dragon would never come back. But if we don't tell, he stays there forever, Arya argued. The bad man is taking our life. He's kissing Mommy. He's eating our food. The realization of their helplessness was a bitter pill for 5-year-olds to swallow. They had always felt protected, shielded by the immense power of their father's name. Now, that name had been stolen, and the power was being used against them. Suddenly, the door to the playroom swung open. Ruin stood there, silhouetted against the bright hallway. He didn't enter. He just leaned against the frame, watching them with a chilling, detached interest. He was holding a small silver tray with 2 glasses of milk. Privacy is a luxury you haven't earned yet, he said softly. He walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He set the milk down on their small activity table and sat in one of the tiny chairs, his long legs looking absurdly out of place. He picked up a stray plastic dragon from the floor, turning it over in his hands. You know, he began, his voice conversational and light. Dragons are very interesting creatures. In the stories, they are always the strongest. But in reality, they are very easy to kill if you know where the soft spot is. Do you know where your father's soft spot is? The girls stared at him, frozen in terror. It's you? Ruin said, snapping the head off the plastic toy with a sickening crack. And it's Nia. He spent his whole life building a fortress of bone and blood, and then he let 3 tiny people walk right through the front gate. That was his mistake. He got soft. He got sentimental. He leaned forward, his face inches from Issei's. I don't have a soft spot. I wasn't raised in a palace. I was raised in a cage. And when you grow up in a cage, you learn that the only thing that matters is the key. Right now, I have the key to your father's cage. And I have the key to this house. He stood up, towering over them once more. Stay in here. If I see you whispering again, I'll assume you're planning to tell Mommy a secret. And we both know what happens then. He left the room, closing the door behind him. The lock clicked, a soft, final sound that echoed like a death knell. Hours passed. The sun began to set over Seoul, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. Inside the penthouse, the family gathered in the theater room. Ruin sat in the center of the oversized couch, Nia tucked into his side, her hand resting on his chest. The twins sat on the floor at their feet, as far away as they could get without looking suspicious. The movie was a bright, colorful animation about a family of adventurers, but the twins couldn't see the screen through the haze of their fear. They were hyper-aware of every movement Ruin made. They watched the way his eyes never truly relaxed, even when he laughed at the screen. They watched the way his hand occasionally tightened on Nia's shoulder, a possessive, territorial gesture that made their skin crawl. Nia was oblivious. She was laughing, sharing popcorn with the man she thought was her husband, occasionally leaning over to whisper something in his ear. To her, this was the beginning of their happily ever after. To her, the war was over. As the movie reached its climax, a scene where the hero finally returns home to save his family, Arya couldn't take it anymore. A small sob escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. Nia was instantly alert. Arya? Baby, what's wrong? She reached down to pick her daughter up, but Ruin was faster. He scooped the child into his arms, his movements fluid and practiced. She's just tired, Nia. It's been a long day for them. I'll take them to bed. You stay here and finish the movie. I know you wanted to see how it ends. Are you sure? Nia asked, her eyes searching Arya's tear-stained face. She looks really upset. I've got her, Ruin said, his voice a soothing balm. He turned Arya away from her mother, his face hidden from Nia's view. As he walked toward the door, he leaned down and whispered into the little girl's ear, his breath cold against her cheek. One more tear, Arya, and I'll make sure he feels it. Do you want your daddy to hurt? Arya went limp in his arms, her sobbing stopping instantly, replaced by a dull, wide-eyed stare. She didn't look at her mother as they were carried out of the room. She didn't look at the toys in the hallway. She looked only at the amber eyes of the monster who was wearing her father's skin. He put them to bed with a cold efficiency, tucking the blankets so tight they felt like cocoons. He didn't tell a story tonight. He just stood in the doorway, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the light of the hall. The dragon is watching you, he said, his voice a final warning. And so am I. He closed the door, and the twins were left in the suffocating darkness of their room. They lay perfectly still, too afraid even to reach for each other's hands. They were prisoners in the sky, trapped in a palace of glass and silk, guarded by a man who was their father's shadow. Outside, the city of Seoul hummed with life, millions of people moving through the streets, unaware that the king of the underworld had been replaced by a ghost. And in the master bedroom, Nia waited for her husband, unaware that she was inviting a killer into her bed. The broken code wasn't just a signal that failed. It was the moment the twins realized that the dragon didn't just have enemies in the streets. He had an enemy in his own mirror. And for the first time in their lives, they were completely, utterly alone. As the hours ticked toward midnight, Ayase finally found the courage to whisper into the dark. Arya, yeah, we have to be brave. Like the story. But the dragon is gone, Arya whispered back, a single tear escaping and soaking into her pillow. No, Ayase said, her voice small but firm. He's not gone. He's just waiting. We have to be his eyes. We have to watch the bad man until the real dragon finds the door. In the silence of the night, 2 5-year-old girls became the only resistance against an empire of lies. They were silent, they were terrified, but they were no longer just victims. They were the only ones who knew the truth, and in the world of the dragon, truth was the only weapon left. Meanwhile, in the study, Ruin sat staring at the black envelope. He opened it, pulling out a single piece of paper. It wasn't a message. It was a list of names. And at the very top of that list, written in the old dragon's elegant, lethal script, was the name, Nia Lauren. A slow, cruel smile spread across Ruin's face. He picked up a pen and drew a single, clean line through the name. The play was moving exactly as planned. The past was being erased one heartbeat at a time. The air in the sub-basement of the Han Group headquarters didn't circulate. It stagnated, heavy with the scent of damp concrete, ozone, and the copper tang of old blood. This wasn't a place for executives or glass-walled boardrooms. This was the Dragon's Belly, a reinforced bunker 4 levels below the street where the city's screams were swallowed by 3 feet of lead-lined steel. Han Du-yoon, the real Dune, was strapped to a heavy industrial chair in the center of the room. His jaw was tight, a thin trail of blood trickling from a split lip where the butt of a rifle had made contact during the ambush. His chest heaved, not from fear, but from a cold, calculating rage that made his amber eyes glow like dying embers in the dim utility light. He had been lured here on the pretext of a breach in the Choi Syndicate's encrypted servers, a security emergency that only his biometric signature could override. He had walked into his own sanctum, only to find the barrels of his own men's weapons leveled at his chest. The heavy steel door groaned on its hinges, and a figure stepped out of the shadows of the corridor. Dune didn't move. He didn't struggle against the reinforced nylon ties cutting into his wrists. He simply watched as Jinho, his lead bodyguard, his shadow, the man who had stood at his back through a dozen assassination attempts, stepped into the circle of light. Jinho's face was a mask of stone, but his hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, were trembling ever so slightly as he adjusted the holster on his hip. "I taught you how to clear a room, Jinho," Dune said, his voice a low, tectonic growl that seemed to vibrate the very chair he was tied to. "I didn't teach you how to hide in one like a coward." Jinho winced at the word, the flinch so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone but Dune. He walked closer, stopping just out of kicking range. "I'm not a coward, Dune. I'm a father. Just like you." Dune's eyes narrowed. "Is that what this is? Payout? The Choi Syndicate offered you a number I couldn't match? I gave you everything. I gave you a life. You gave me a job," Jinho corrected, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp emotion. "The old dragon. He gave me my family's lives. 10 years, Dune. For 10 years, I have been his eyes in your house. Every move you made, every secret you thought you buried, I handed to him on a silver platter." The silence that followed was absolute. Dune felt a coldness settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Jinho hadn't just betrayed him. Jinho was the reason the accident in London had been possible. Jinho was the leak that had allowed the black envelopes to find their mark. "My wife, my son," Jinho whispered, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a crumpled photograph. He held it up so Dune could see a young woman and a boy in a park, smiling. He took them the day you were named successor. He told me that as long as you were the loyal son he wanted, they would live in luxury. But the moment you looked at Nia Lauren, the moment you started thinking about leaving the life, their clock started ticking. He's playing you, Dune spat, his muscles straining against the restraints. The old dragon doesn't keep his word. He keeps leverage. If you help him kill me, you're useless to him. He'll bury your family in the same hole he puts me in. Maybe, Jinho said, his eyes glassy. But today I don't have a choice. He sent the replacement. And he gave me an order. Jinho turned toward a wall of monitors that lined the back of the bunker. With a few keystrokes, the screens flickered to life. Dune's heart skipped a beat as the high-definition feed showed the interior of his own penthouse. The lighting was soft, the atmosphere domestic and warm, a sickening contrast to the concrete tomb he was currently sitting in. On the screen, Nia was sitting on the velvet sofa. She looked radiant, the tension of the past years seemingly wiped away. And standing behind her was the man with the gray eyes, the man wearing Dune's face, Dune's clothes, and Dune's life. Look at her, Dune, Jinho said, his voice hollow. She can't tell. She thinks she finally has the man she dreamed of. The version of you that doesn't smell like gunpowder. Dune watched, his breath hitching, as the man Ruin leaned down. On the screen, Ruin whispered something into Nia's ear that made her laugh. A bright, melodic sound that tore through Dune's chest like a jagged blade. He saw Nia reach up, her fingers grazing Ruin's cheek, the same way she used to touch him in the quiet hours of the morning. Stop it, Dune hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of agony and fury. Turn it off, Jinho. Kill me if you're going to do it, but turn it off. I can't, Jinho said, staring at the floor. He wants you to see what happens when a dragon tries to have a heart. He wants you to watch your world be inhabited by a ghost. On the monitor, the scene shifted to something even more devastating. The twins, Ayase and Arya, ran into the frame. They looked hesitant, their small bodies stiff, but Ruin knelt down and pulled them into a hug. From this angle, Dune could see Ruin's face over their shoulders. Ruin wasn't smiling at the children. He was looking directly into the hidden camera lens, staring straight at the basement, staring straight at Dune. Ruin's lips moved, silent on the feed, but Dune could read them perfectly. Mine now. Dune's scream was a raw, primal sound that echoed off the concrete walls. He threw his weight forward, the heavy chair skidding inches across the floor. The guards in the shadows shifted, their fingers tightening on their triggers, but Jinho held up a hand. Wait, Jinho commanded. Dune was gasping for air, his forehead slick with sweat. He's going to kill them, Jinho. You know him. The old dragon doesn't leave witnesses. Once Ruin has the codes to the Han Group's offshore accounts, Nia and the girls are dead. Your family is dead. This isn't a transition of power. It's a slaughter. Jinho looked at the screen again. He saw Nia lean in and kiss Ruin. A soft, lingering kiss on the lips. The real Dune closed his eyes, his head falling back against the chair. A sob of pure, unadulterated rage trapped in his throat. The betrayal of his body by his brother was one thing, but the betrayal of Nia's love, even if she didn't know it, was a wound he couldn't survive. He told me that if I did this, Jinho said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the servers, he would send me a video of my son being released. I'm waiting for the notification. You're waiting for a ghost, Dune whispered, his voice suddenly calm, a deadly, predatory stillness settling over him. Look at me, Jinho. Look at my eyes. Jinho reluctantly turned his gaze back to his boss. You've been my shadow for 10 years, Dune said, his amber eyes locking onto Jinho's with a terrifying intensity. You know I don't believe in luck. I believe in preparation. Did you really think I didn't know you were talking to my father? Did you think I didn't notice the encrypted pings coming from your handset every Tuesday at midnight? Jinho froze. What? I let you stay because I thought I could protect your family from the inside. Dune lied, his voice a smooth, convincing silk. He needed Jinho to doubt. He needed a crack in the armor. I have a team in Singapore. They've been tracking the old dragon's courier. If I don't check in by sunrise, the operation to rescue your son is aborted. You're not choosing between me and your family, Jinho. You're choosing which one of us dies first. Jinho's face paled. You're lying. You couldn't have known. Check your private secure drop, Jinho, Dune said, nodding toward the terminal. The folder labeled White Lily. See for yourself. As Jinho turned toward the terminal, his back to Dune, the real dragon began to move. He didn't struggle against the ties. He relaxed. He had been trained by the best interrogators in the East to dislocate his joints on command. With a sickening pop that went unheard over the hum of the monitors, Dune's left thumb tucked into his palm. He felt the skin tear and the bone shift, a white-hot flash of pain blinding him for a second, but he didn't make a sound. He began to slide his hand through the nylon loop, the blood acting as a lubricant. On the monitor, Ruin was leading Nia toward the bedroom. He turned back one last time to look at the camera, a slow, mocking wave of his hand. I don't see any folder, Jinho shouted, his frustration boiling over. There's nothing here but... Jinho turned back, but he was too late. Dune's hand was free, a mangled, bloody mess of flesh and bone. In one fluid motion, he reached into the hidden seam of the chair's upholstery, a modification he had made to every interrogation chair in the building years ago. His fingers closed around a ceramic blade, no longer than a finger but sharper than a razor. He slashed through the leg restraints before the guards in the shadows could even raise their weapons. Jinho down, Dune roared. The room erupted. The guards opened fire, the muzzles flashing in the darkness. Dune dived behind the heavy marble desk in the corner, the ceramic blade tucked into his palm. He wasn't the Dragon of Soul because of his money or his name. He was the dragon because when the lights went out, he was the most dangerous thing in the room. Jinho stood in the center of the crossfire, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his reality. Dune, is he alive? Is my son alive? Dune didn't answer. He lunged from behind the desk, a shadow among shadows. He moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man who had just been tortured. He caught the first guard under the chin, the ceramic blade sliding into the soft tissue with a sickening squelch. He used the man's body as a shield, grabbing his sidearm and firing 3 shots in rapid succession. 3 guards fell. The room went silent, save for the heavy breathing of the 2 men left standing. Dune stood up, his shirt soaked in blood. Some his, mostly not. He looked at the monitor. The penthouse was quiet. The bedroom door was closed. He looked at Jinho, who was holding his head in his hands, his gun lying forgotten on the floor. The folder was a lie, wasn't it? Jinho asked, his voice broken. Yes, Dune said, his voice as cold as the concrete. But the threat to your family is real. My father has them, Jinho, and he has mine. The only way any of them breathe again is if we stop that man upstairs. Dune walked over to the monitors. He stared at the closed bedroom door on the screen. The rage he felt was no longer a hot, blinding thing. It had crystallized into a sharp, freezing clarity. His brother was upstairs, touching the woman he loved, playing with the children he had bled for. He picked up a discarded radio from one of the fallen guards. He didn't call for backup. He didn't call the police. He tuned it to the private frequency of the penthouse's internal intercom. He pressed the button. He didn't say Nia's name. He didn't scream. He just whispered for words, his voice a promise of the carnage to come. I'm coming for you. Upstairs, on the silent monitor, Dune saw the bedroom door crack open. Ruin stepped out into the hallway, his head cocking to the side as he heard the static-filled whisper from the wall unit. For the first time, the smirk vanished from Ruin's face. The basement was no longer a trap. It was a launching pad. The dragon was out of his cage, and he was no longer interested in debt. He was interested in extinction. Jinho, Dune said, not looking back as he headed for the service elevator. Pick up your gun. We're going home. The fog in London 6 years ago didn't just drift. It haunted. It was a thick, silver shroud that swallowed the streetlights of Park Lane and turned the grand entrance of the Hyatt into a ghostly monolith. Inside, the air was different, pressurized, smelling of expensive lilies and the faint, ozone scent of a storm about to break. For years, the story of room 4002 had been a simple one. A woman suffering a panic attack, a man poisoned and dying, and a chance encounter that rewrote their destinies. But memory is a flickering candle. And when you change the angle of the light, the shadows reveal a different truth entirely. Nia Lauren hadn't been wandering the halls of the 40th floor by accident. In the true version of that night, the one buried in the encrypted archives of the Han family, Nia was moving with a purpose she didn't fully understand, her mind clouded by a strange, metallic lethargy. She remembered the fire alarm, a distant, rhythmic pulsing, and the way the golden wallpaper of the hallway seemed to breathe. But she didn't remember the woman walking 5 paces behind her. This woman didn't just resemble Nia. She was a biological echo. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray trench coat that bled into the shadows of the alcoves. Her hair was pulled back into a clinical, tight bun, and her eyes, though the same shape as Nia's, held the cold, vacant stare of a high-altitude predator. As Nia stumbled near the door of room 4002, her breath hitching in the onset of a panic attack, the woman in gray didn't offer help. She reached out with a gloved hand and pressed a small, pressurized device against the small of Nia's back. A sharp hiss, a momentary sting, and the world tilted. Nia's knees buckled. Her hand caught the brass handle of the door, which had been left unlocked by a clumsy maid who had been paid 6 months' salary to forget her keys. The woman in gray leaned in close, her voice a chilling mirror of Nia's own pitch. "Go inside, number 7. The woman whispered, her breath smelling of nothing but mint and sterile air. "Save the dragon. It's what you were grown for." With a firm, calculated shove, the woman pushed Nia into the darkened suite. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, locking from the outside with a sound that was final, like a lid closing on a coffin. Inside the room, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the copper tang of blood. Han Du-yoon was slumped against the far wall, his face pale, his veins standing out like black ink beneath his skin. He had been poisoned by his own father's tea, a neurotoxin designed to paralyze his heart, while leaving his mind wide awake to witness his own end. He was a dying god in a silk suit. But the plan hadn't been for a simple assassination. The old dragon didn't believe in waste. If his son was to die, he would die producing something useful. If he was to live, he would be anchored to a variable the family could control. Hidden behind a two-way mirror in the adjoining suite, a team of technicians in white lab coats watched the thermal feed. They weren't soldiers. They were geneticists. At the center of the room stood the old dragon himself, his silhouette sharp against the glow of the monitors. He watched as Nia crawled toward the bed, her fingers trembling as she reached for the man who was supposed to be her executioner. "Vital signs are peaking," a technician murmured, his fingers dancing across a keyboard. "Subject 7's phenomenal output is a 99% match for the override sequence. The dragon's heart rate is stabilizing. The anchor is holding." The old dragon leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the amber heat of the thermal scan. "She doesn't know what she is?" "No, sir," the lead scientist replied. "The amnesiac block is total. She believes she is Nia Lauren, a girl from the South with a history of anxiety. She believes her panic attack drove her into this room. She believes she is a victim of chance." "Good," the old dragon whispered. "Chance is the most convincing lie we have. Let them bond in the dark. Let the dragon think he found a miracle in the middle of a massacre. He will fight harder to protect a miracle than he ever would to protect an empire." This was the London paradox. The wrong room was the only room Nia was ever meant to be in. She wasn't an innocent variable who accidentally saved a king. She was a high-tech biological contingency, part of the Chrysalis Project, a decades-long genetic program run by the Han family to breed the perfect companions for their bloodline. Companions who could stabilize the volatile, high-functioning sociopathy that ran in the Han DNA. The twins, Ayase and Arya, weren't just a surprise. They were the goal. They were the first generation of a new dynasty, born from a curated union that the world thought was a romance, but the Han family knew was a harvest. As Nia sat on the floor of room 4002 6 years ago, holding the hand of a dying Dune and whispering words of comfort she didn't know she possessed, the woman in the charcoal coat stood in the hallway outside. She pulled a burner phone from her pocket and dialed a number that didn't exist on any public registry. "The seed is planted," the woman said, her voice devoid of any sisterly warmth. "The dragon has taken the bait. Proceed to phase 2, the exile." The woman looked at the door one last time. For a split second, a flicker of something human crossed her face. A shadow of grief, or perhaps envy. She was number 6. She was the prototype that had failed because her heart was too cold to anchor a man like Dune. She was the sister Nia never knew she had, the one who had been relegated to the role of a ghost so that Nia could live the lie of a human life. Back in the present day, in the basement of the Seoul headquarters, Dune stared at the decrypted file Jinho had just pulled up. The White Lily folder wasn't a lie about Jinho's family. It was the truth about his own. He watched the grainy, black and white security footage from the Hyatt in London, timestamped 6 years ago. He saw Nia. He saw the woman in the gray coat. He saw the shove. The ceramic blade in Dune's hand shook. His whole life, his rebellion against his father, his flight to find Nia, his belief that he had chosen his own path. It was all a scripted play. He hadn't rescued Nia from the streets. He had been delivered to her in a cage of his father's making. "She's one of them," Jinho whispered, his voice trembling as he watched the footage. "Dune, she isn't just a girl from London. She's a weapon, a biological anchor. Your father didn't just give you a brother. He grew you a wife." Dune's amber eyes fixed on the screen where the woman in gray was walking away from the door. She had Nia's face. She had Nia's height. She was the mirror Nia didn't know existed. "No," Dune said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "Nia doesn't know. If she knew, she wouldn't have looked at me like I was her sun and her moon. She's a victim of this more than I am." "But the twins," Jinho argued, "if they are part of this project, then Ruin isn't just there to replace you. He's there to reclaim the assets." Dune looked at his mangled hand, the blood now drying into a dark crust. The physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological vertigo of realizing his children were assets in a ledger he hadn't known existed. He thought of the way Nia had looked at him that morning, her eyes full of a trust that was now the most dangerous thing in the world. If Ruin was number 2 and he was number 1, who was the woman in gray? And how many more of them were hiding in the shadows of his life? The London paradox was simple. You cannot escape a trap if you believe the trap is your sanctuary. "We're not just going back for Nia and the girls," Dune said, his voice hardening into something sharper than the ceramic blade. "We're going back to burn the script. My father thinks he holds the pen. I'm going to find out what happens when the characters stop following the lines." He turned away from the monitor. The image of the woman in gray burned into his retinas. The past was no longer a memory. It was a crime scene. And as the elevator began to rise toward the penthouse, the dragon wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for the right to be a man, and not just a masterpiece of genetic engineering. The storm outside the Seoul headquarters broke then, a flash of lightning illuminating the city in a cold, unforgiving white. In the penthouse, Nia woke up from a dream of London, a dream of a woman in a gray coat pushing her into the dark. She sat up, her heart racing, and looked at the man sleeping beside her, the man she thought was her husband. For the first time, she noticed the way his breathing was perfectly timed, like a metronome. It wasn't the ragged, human rhythm of the man she loved. It was the sound of a machine waiting for a command. She looked at her own hands in the moonlight. "Who am I?" The thought whispered in the back of her mind, a seed of doubt planted 6 years ago finally beginning to bloom. Am I the girl who wandered into a room, or am I the girl who was made for it? The answer was waiting in the hallway, where the real dragon was ascending, ready to tear the world apart to find the truth. The morning after the film, the penthouse was bathed in a deceptive, golden tranquility. The city of Seoul sprawled out beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows like a circuit board, humming with a life that felt a million miles away from the silent, pressurized atmosphere of the Han residence. Nia sat at the breakfast nook, the sunlight catching the steam rising from her cup. She felt a strange, lingering fog in her mind, a residue of the London paradox she didn't yet understand, but her body was on high alert. The instinct that had kept her alive in the shadows for 5 years was screaming, even as her heart tried to lull her back to sleep. Across the marble island, the man she believed was her husband was reading a digital tablet. He looked perfect. His hair was impeccably styled. His black silk shirt sat flawlessly against his shoulders, and the amber glow of his eyes seemed to radiate a newfound peace. He looked like the version of Han Du-yoon she had prayed for, a man who had finally laid down his burden. "You're staring, Nia," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that usually made her skin tingle. He didn't look up from the screen, but a small, charming smile played on his lips. Is there something on my face? Or am I just that much better looking in the morning light? Nia forced a soft laugh, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and took a sip of her tea. I'm just not used to seeing you so. Still. Usually, by this time, you've fired 3 people and broken at least 1 phone. I told you, he murmured, finally looking up. The amber lenses he wore were a masterpiece, mimicking the depth and fire of the real dragon's gaze. I'm making a choice to be here, truly here, with you. He reached out for his coffee cup. It was a mundane, everyday movement, but as his fingers closed around the porcelain handle, Nia's heart performed a sickening somersault. He picked up the cup with his right hand. He didn't just pick it up. He used it with a fluid, dominant grace. He lifted the cup, blew on the steam, and took a sip, his right thumb hooked comfortably over the rim. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Nia felt the blood drain from her face, her extremities turning to ice. Han Du-yoon was left-handed. It was a detail so ingrained in their life that she had stopped noticing it. He wore his watch on his right wrist. He reached for her with his left. When he wrote, his pen tilted in that specific, awkward angle of a southpaw. Most importantly, the scar on his left hand, the jagged mark from Macau, was the hand he used for everything of importance. She looked down at his left hand resting on the table. The scar was there. It was perfect. The jagged lines, the slightly raised tissue, the way it puckered near the knuckle. But the hand was idle. It was a prop. The man sitting across from her was an imposter. Her first instinct was to scream, to throw the hot tea into his face and run for the twins. But as she looked at him, she saw the cold, mechanical stillness behind his eyes. This wasn't just a man. It was a predator who had studied his prey until he could wear its skin. If she screamed, she wouldn't make it to the hallway. If she ran, she would be dead before she hit the elevator. Play along, her survival instinct whispered. Asterisk if he thinks you know, you're dead. If he thinks you're fooled, you have a chance. Asterisk. Nia took a slow, measured breath, forcing her lungs to expand even as her chest felt like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press. She reached out and placed her hand over his idle left hand, feeling the skin. Felt real, felt warm, but there was no pulse of recognition in the touch. I forgot to ask, she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. Did you ever find that black envelope? The one from the lobby. The man's eyes didn't flicker. He didn't miss a beat. He set the coffee cup down again with his right hand and laced his fingers together. It was nothing, Nia. Just a disgruntled associate trying to make a scene. I had Jinho dispose of it. We don't need those ghosts in this house. Jinho. If this man was here and Jinho had disposed of the threat, then Jinho was either dead or he was the one who had opened the gate. The realization that their most trusted protector was gone made the penthouse feel less like a sanctuary and more like a glass coffin. I'm glad, Nia said, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm going to go check on the girls. They were a bit restless last night. Of course, Ruin said, his voice dripping with synthetic warmth. Take your time. I have a few calls to make. Nia stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She walked out of the kitchen, her back tingling with the sensation of his eyes following her. She didn't look back. She made it to the girls' room and slipped inside, closing the door and locking it with a trembling hand. Ayase and Arya were sitting on the floor, their breakfast untouched. They looked up as she entered, and the look in their eyes confirmed her worst fears. They didn't look like children. They looked like soldiers in a foxhole. They knew. They had known before she did. Mommy, Arya whispered, her voice a tiny, fractured sound. Nia knelt on the floor, pulling them both into a fierce, silent embrace. She pressed her face into their hair, smelling the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo, and felt a sob threatening to break through her throat. She couldn't cry. Not yet. Listen to me, Nia whispered, her lips against Ayse's ear. We're going to play a game. A very important game. Like the stories Daddy tells you. The girls nodded, their bodies stiff. Nia reached for their lunchboxes, which sat on the small table by the door. She grabbed a scrap of paper and a crayon from the floor. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the wax. Asterisk if the lights go out, run to the old oak. Don't stop for anyone. Not even me. Wait for the real dragon. Asterisk. She folded the notes into tiny squares and slipped one into each of the girls' sandwich containers, hidden beneath the bread. The old oak wasn't a tree. It was the code name for a small, reinforced panic room built into the foundation of the building's courtyard. A place Dune had shown her once, just in case. Do you remember the secret path to the garden? Nia asked, her eyes locking onto theirs. They nodded. If the lights go out, she breathed. You go there. You don't look back. You stay silent like little shadows. Do you understand? Is the bad man going to hurt you? Isa asked, a single tear rolling down her cheek. Nia cupped her daughter's face. No one is going to hurt anyone. We're just going to find the real daddy. But I need you to be the bravest dragons in the world for me. Can you do that? Before they could answer, the door handle turned. The lock held, but only for a second. Nia? Ruin's voice came through the wood, muffled and smooth. Is everything okay in there? The girls should be getting ready for their lessons. Nia stood up, smoothing her skirt and wiping the moisture from her eyes. She signaled the girls to start packing their bags. We're fine, she called out, her voice pitched high and cheerful. Just a little mishap with some spilled juice. We'll be out in a second. She opened the door and there he was. He was leaning against the opposite wall, his arms crossed. He looked at the girls, then at Nia. The air between them felt electric, a silent war of wills. You're acting strange, Nia, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. The amber lenses seemed to catch a glint of the hallway light, turning them into cold, hard jewels. Is the city air getting to you again? Maybe you should lie down. I'm just tired, she said, stepping past him and leading the girls toward the foyer. A long night of movies and popcorn. You know how it is. I do, he replied, following them. I know exactly how it is. As they reached the foyer, the elevator chimed. Ruin stepped in front of the doors, his hand resting casually on his belt, right where a concealed weapon would be. Where are you going? He asked. Just taking them down to the courtyard for some fresh air before their tutor arrives, Nia said. She gripped the girl's hands so hard her knuckles were white. Is that a problem? Ruin stared at her for a long beat. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Then he stepped aside, his smile returning like a mask being snapped back into place. No problem at all. Just be back in 20 minutes. I've scheduled a family lunch. I'm making something special. Nia entered the elevator with the girls. As the doors began to slide shut, she saw Ruin standing in the hallway. He wasn't waving. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was just watching, his right hand, the dominant hand, resting on the doorframe. The elevator began its descent. Nia slumped against the mirrored wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at her daughters. They were holding their lunchboxes like shields. Mommy, Arya whispered. The man's eyes. They're not the right color. Not inside. I know, baby, Nia said, her voice hardening. I know. She looked at the floor indicator. Asterisk 40, 30, 20, asterisk. She had 20 minutes. 20 minutes to find a way out or a way to fight back. She thought of the London paradox, the idea that she was grown for this. If she was a weapon, it was time to find the trigger. As the doors opened onto the ground floor, Nia didn't head for the main exit where the guards were. She headed for the service corridor, pulling the twins into the shadows. The hunt had begun, but the predator didn't realize that the anchor had finally cut the line. The silence in the sub-basement of the Han headquarters was the kind of silence that preceded a landslide, heavy, breathless, and laden with the scent of impending ruin. Han Du-yoon, the man the world knew as the dragon, sat motionless in the center of the concrete tomb. The high-definition monitors on the wall continued to flicker, broadcasting the slow-motion theft of his life. He watched the man who wore his face lean in toward Nia, saw the casual, right-handed grace with which the imposter navigated the penthouse, and felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over his soul. The rage that had been a roaring fire moments ago had refined itself into a surgical instrument. He looked down at his left hand. The nylon restraints were industrial-grade, reinforced with a high-tensile wire core that laughed at raw strength. They were designed to hold a man of his build, a man of his power. But the architects of this trap had forgotten one thing. A dragon would rather tear off its own wings than live in a cage. Dune closed his eyes, drawing a long, jagged breath into lungs that felt like they were filled with crushed glass. He visualized the anatomy of his own hand, the intricate web of small bones, the ligaments that anchored his strength. He didn't hesitate. With a sudden, violent jerk of his wrist against the immovable steel of the chair's armrest, he applied a lateral pressure that defied nature. The sound was sickening, a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the damp concrete walls like a gunshot. White-hot agony erupted from his thumb, a blinding supernova of pain that threatened to plunge him into unconsciousness. His vision fractured, the gray room spinning into a kaleidoscope of nausea. He didn't scream. He bit into his lower lip until the copper tang of his own blood filled his mouth, using the new pain to anchor his mind against the old. His left thumb now hung at an impossible, grotesque angle, the joint completely pulverized. He didn't stop to breathe. Gritting his teeth until his jaw felt like it might shatter, he began to thread his mangled hand through the narrow loop of the restraint. The jagged edges of the broken bone scraped against the nylon, and the skin tore, hot blood acting as a gruesome lubricant. Every millimeter of movement felt like a lifetime of torture, but slowly the hand slid through. The restraint fell away, clicking against the floor. Dune slumped forward, his chest heaving, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. He didn't allow himself more than 5 seconds of recovery. Using his right hand, he fumbled for the release on his legs, his fingers slippery with his own gore. When the last strap fell away, he collapsed to the floor, his knees hitting the cold concrete with a dull thud. He stayed there for a beat, a wounded predator gathering the remnants of his strength, before forcing himself to stand. He ignored the guards lying in the shadows, men he had neutralized in the initial scuffle, men who had been his own until the old dragon whispered a different set of orders. He didn't look for a weapon yet. He looked for the source of the nightmare. On the heavy mahogany desk that served as the bunker's nerve center lay the original black envelope. It was identical to the one Ruin had held in the lobby, matte finish, heavy cardstock, sealed with the embossed wax crest of the Han family. What slid out was a single, yellowed sheet of archival parchment, a birth certificate from a private clinic in Macau, dated 31 years ago. Dune's eyes scanned the elegant, cursive script, searching for his own name, for Ruin's name. But as he read the section marked Live Births, the world didn't just tilt, it vanished. Subject 1A, Han Du-yoon. Subject 1B, Han Ruin. Subject 1C, Han Vesper. The word triplets was stamped in red ink at the bottom of the page, nearly obscured by a sprawling signature he recognized all too well, the old dragon's mark. Dune felt a phantom coldness sweep through the room. There wasn't just one brother. There wasn't just a replacement and an original. There was a third player, a shadow within a shadow. He thought back to the London paradox, the woman in the gray coat who had pushed Nia into room 4002. He had assumed she was a genetic echo, a prototype of the Chrysalis project. But the birth certificate suggested something far more intimate and far more lethal. Vesper. The name sounded like a dying breath. If Ruin was the blade and he was the shield, what was Vesper? He looked back at the monitors, his eyes frantically searching the penthouse feeds. He saw Ruin in the kitchen, saw Nia in the hallway, saw the twins in their room. Everything looked as it had moments ago. But now, every shadow in the corner of the screen felt like a threat. Every blind spot in the camera's range felt like a hiding place for the third sibling. Triplets? A voice croaked from the floor. Dune spun around, his right hand instinctively reaching for a discarded sidearm on the desk. It was Jinho. The bodyguard was propped up against a server rack, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder where a stray bullet had found him during Dune's escape. His face was the color of ash, but his eyes were fixed on the paper in Dune's hand. "You knew?" Dune hissed, stepping over to him, the ceramic blade he had retrieved from the chair's lining glinting in the dim light. "I knew about the twins," Jinho gasped, coughing up a fleck of blood. "I knew the old dragon had a spare. But Vesper was the one they never talked about. The one they said was too unstable for the world." "Where is she, Jinho?" Dune grabbed the bodyguard by the collar, ignoring the scream of pain from his own broken thumb. "Is she in the penthouse? Is she the one watching Nia? She's everywhere." "Dune," Jinho whispered, his grip on Dune's arm weakening. "Ruin is just the face. Vesper is the ghost." She doesn't want the empire. She wants the blood. She's the one who handled the disposals for your father. If she's there, she's not there to replace Nia. She's there to end the line. Dune let go of Jinho, the weight of the revelation threatening to crush him. The trap wasn't just about a brother taking his seat. It was about a sister wiping the slate clean. If Vesper was the third triplet, she shared his DNA, his instincts, and his ruthlessness, but without the anchor of a heart. He looked at the birth certificate one last time before shoving it into his pocket. The black envelope wasn't a threat of what was coming. It was a confession of what had always been. His entire existence had been a curated experiment, a triad of siblings designed to ensure the Han family's survival through any means necessary. And now the experiment was entering its final, most violent phase. "Can you stand?" Dune asked, his voice returning to that cold, commanding vibration. Jinho struggled, using the server rack for leverage. "I can walk. I can shoot." "Then we leave," Dune said. He picked up 2 more magazines from the desk and checked the action on his handgun. "The elevator is compromised. We used the ventilation shaft to reach the parking garage. We have 18 minutes before Ruin expects a check-in from this basement." "Dune," Jinho said, stopping him as they reached the air duct. "If Vesper is there, Nia won't see her coming. She looks exactly like her. The genetic project. They didn't just grow Nia to be your anchor. They grew her to be Vesper's mirror." The horror of the statement hung in the air. The woman in the gray coat in London wasn't just a scientist or a handler. She was his sister. And she had been grooming Nia for 6 years to be the perfect, unsuspecting victim. Dune didn't respond. He couldn't. If he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the betrayal, he would never make it out of the basement. He kicked the grate off the ventilation shaft, the metal clattering against the floor. He pulled himself up with his right arm, the pain in his left hand now a dull, throbbing background noise to the singular purpose driving him forward. He wasn't just going back to save his wife and children. He was going back to face the 2 people who shared his blood and his face, but none of his soul. The dragon was no longer fighting a war of syndicates or territories. He was fighting a war of identity. As they crawled through the narrow, dark shafts of the building, the sound of the city's traffic humming above them, Dune felt the ceramic blade pressed against his thigh. He thought of the birth certificate, the names 1A, 1B, and 1C. The old dragon had always said that a house divided cannot stand. Dune was going to prove him right. He was going to burn the house down, even if he was the last thing left in the ashes. The basement was left behind, a tomb of secrets and blood. But as they emerged into the dimly lit parking garage, the real battle began. The rain was still falling outside, a relentless gray curtain that hid the monsters of Seoul. And somewhere high above, in a penthouse filled with silk and glass, the third player was waiting for the lights to go out. The rain that had been a rhythmic backdrop to the nightmare suddenly intensified, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse with the force of 1,000 seeking fingers. Inside, the air was static, charged with a tension so thick it felt like breathing through wool. Nia stood in the shadows of the master kitchen, her fingers hovering over the concealed auxiliary breaker panel. Dune had once shown her in a moment of rare, paranoid transparency. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her mind was a cold, sharp blade. She had seen the right-handed coffee sip. She had seen the vacant gray behind the amber lenses. The man in the study wasn't her husband. He was the ghost of a life she was finally realizing was a scripted lie. With a sharp, decisive click, Nia threw the master kill switch. The transition was violent. 1 second, the penthouse was a golden palace of silk and light. The next, it was a cavern of absolute, suffocating ink. The hum of the climate control died, replaced by the sudden, haunting roar of the wind against the glass. Nia didn't wait for her eyes to adjust. She knew this floor plan better than she knew her own reflection. She moved with the silent, desperate grace of a mother whose children were the only thing left in a burning world. She reached the twins' room in 3 seconds. She didn't call their names. She simply reached into the darkness and felt 2 small, trembling bodies huddle against her legs. They didn't scream. They had been waiting for the signal. "The lunchboxes," Nia whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "To the old oak." Now, they moved as a single unit, a 3-headed shadow slipping through the velvet darkness of the hallway. But the penthouse wasn't just a home. It was a hunting ground. And the man who had been reading in the study wasn't hindered by the dark. A faint, high-pitched whine, the sound of electronics powering up, echoed from the far end of the corridor. Nia froze. She didn't need to see him to know what was happening. Ruin had engaged his thermal optics. To him, the darkness was no longer a veil. It was a transparent playground where Nia and the twins were three glowing, heat-mapped targets pulsing in shades of orange and red. Nia, Ruin's voice drifted through the blackness, calm and terrifyingly rhythmic. The power grid in this building is redundant. Cutting the mains only proves you've been paying attention to my brother's bedtime stories. But stories don't win wars, number 7. Biology does. Nia pushed the twins toward the service stairs, her hand grazing Esse's shoulder. Run, she mouthed, though they couldn't see her. She felt them slip away, their light footsteps disappearing into the carpeted void. She turned back, standing in the center of the grand hallway, her chest heaving. She was the decoy. She was the anchor. If she could keep the heat of her own body centered in his sights, the girls might make it to the courtyard. A beam of pale, spectral light, not from a flashlight, but the eerie glow of the thermal goggles' external display, cut through the dark. Ruin was moving with a slow, mechanical precision. He didn't run, he stalked. Every footfall was a calculated erasure of distance. You were grown to be a stabilizer, Nia, Ruin said, his voice closer now, coming from the direction of the dining room. A way to keep the dragon from burning the world down. But a stabilizer is useless when the dragon is already dead. You're holding onto a ghost. Nia grabbed a heavy glass vase from a side table, her fingers slipping on the cold crystal. She hurled it toward the sound of his voice. It shattered against a marble pillar with a sound like a gunshot, but Ruin didn't even flinch. He was 5 feet away now. She could smell the sandalwood and the cold, metallic scent of his equipment. The real Dune wouldn't have used his right hand. Nia spat into the dark, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and defiance. He would have known his daughter's secret signal. You're a masterpiece of a man, Ruin, but you're a failure as a human. The silence that followed was heavy with a sudden, sharp malice. Then, a hand, cold, strong, and devoid of hesitation, clamped around Nia's throat. She was slammed back against the wall, the back of her head hitting the plaster with a sickening thud. The world blossomed into 1,000 white sparks. She clawed at his wrist, her nails digging into the silk of his sleeve, but his grip was like an industrial vice. She looked up, and though she couldn't see his face, she felt the intensity of his gaze behind the thermal lenses. He was watching the heat of her life struggle beneath his fingers. A failure, Ruin whispered, leaning in so close his lips brushed her ear. I am the evolution. My brother was a man who let a hotel room in London dictate his destiny. I am the man who dictates the room. And since you've decided to cut the anchor, I suppose it's time to sink the ship. He shifted his weight, his free hand reaching for the tactical blade at his hip. Nia felt the cold air on her skin as the steel was unsheathed. She closed her eyes, thinking of the twins in the dark, praying they were close to the old oak. She had failed him. She had failed the real dragon. But then the world exploded. The sound wasn't a gunshot. It was the violent, hydraulic hiss of the private elevator's emergency override. The heavy brass doors didn't just slide open. They were blown off their tracks by a breaching charge that sent a shockwave of dust and heat through the penthouse. In the sudden, strobe-like flicker of the emergency lights, a silhouette stepped out of the smoke. He didn't look like a king. He didn't look like an executive. He looked like a nightmare that had crawled out of a mass grave. His left hand was a mangled, bloody mess wrapped in a strip of black silk. His clothes were shredded, soaked in a mixture of rain and gore. But his eyes, even in the flickering, dim light, were a blazing, unmistakable amber. Get your hands. The real Dune growled, his voice a raw, tectonic vibration that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Off my wife. Ruin didn't let go immediately. He turned his head, the thermal goggles glowing a ghostly green on his face. Subject 1A. I was told you were at the bottom of the belly. The belly wasn't deep enough, Dune replied. He didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He raised a heavy tactical sidearm with his steady right hand and fired. The bullet grazed Ruin's shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him away from Nia. She slumped to the floor, gasping for air, her hands clutching her bruised throat. Dune moved like a blur. He didn't wait for Ruin to recover. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, his boots thudding against the carpet with the weight of a god's judgment. Ruin dropped his goggles, his own gray eyes finally exposed in the flickering light, wide with a mixture of shock and the primal recognition of his own end. The 2 brothers, identical in face, but worlds apart in soul, collided in the center of the darkened hall. It was a brutal, unchoreographed symphony of violence. Ruin fought with a clinical, sociopathic efficiency, his strikes aimed at Dune's mangled left arm. But Dune fought with a desperate, animalistic ferocity. He wasn't fighting for an empire. He was fighting for the 3 heartbeats that gave his life meaning. Dune caught a strike from Ruin's right hand, ignoring the agony that flared through his broken thumb as he used his mangled hand to trap his brother's wrist. He drove his forehead into Ruin's nose, the sound of breaking bone echoing through the quiet room. "You thought you could wear my life?" Dune hissed, his face inches from Ruin's. "You thought you could touch them?" He threw Ruin toward the glass wall, the imposter crashing against the reinforced pane. The glass didn't break, but the sound was like a thunderclap. Ruin scrambled to his feet, reaching for his fallen blade, but Dune was already there, pinning him against the window. Nia watched from the floor, her vision blurring. She saw 2 identical men silhouetted against the storm outside, their movements a mirror image of rage and survival. For a second, as the emergency lights flickered out again, she couldn't tell who was who. "Dune!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Both men turned their heads. In that split second of distraction, Ruin lunged. He drove his shoulder into Dune's chest, sending them both tumbling over the back of the velvet sofa and into the darkness of the living area. The sound of their struggle, the heavy thuds, the ragged breathing, the clatter of steel on marble, was the only thing that broke the silence of the blackout. Nia scrambled toward the hallway, her hands searching for the twins. She found them huddled by the service door, their eyes wide with a terror that no 5-year-old should ever know. "Go," Nia whispered, pushing them toward the stairs. "Go to the old oak. I'll find you." "But Daddy," Isa started. "Go," Nia commanded, her voice a whip-crack of motherly authority. As the twins disappeared down the stairs, Nia turned back to the darkness of the living room. The struggle had moved toward the balcony doors. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene. One man held the other by the throat, their bodies pressed against the railing 40 stories above the street. A shot rang out, a sharp, muffled crack. One of the men stumbled back, clutching his side. The other moved forward, his silhouette towering in the rain that was now pouring through a shattered pane. "Nia," the man in the rain called out. His voice was strained, heavy with pain. "It's over." Nia stood frozen in the center of the room. The man walking toward her had the amber eyes. He had the scar on his left hand. He had the voice that had haunted her dreams for 6 years. But as he stepped into the faint, dying glow of a backup light, she saw him reach out to her with his right hand. She looked at the floor. The ceramic blade was lying in a pool of blood. She looked at the railing, where the other man had disappeared into the dark. "Dune," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's me, Nia," he said, walking closer, his hand reaching for her face. "I promise, it's me." But as his hand touched her cheek, Nia didn't feel the warmth of the dragon. She felt the cold, rhythmic precision of a machine. She looked down at his wrist, the wrist she had tapped twice that morning. There was no double tap. There was only the sound of the rain. "Where are the girls, Nia?" the man asked, his smile a perfect, terrifying mask. "We need to find them, before the others arrive." Nia's blood turned to ice. She looked past him toward the elevator, where a second silhouette was slowly rising from the floor, clutching a mangled, bloody left hand. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had just multiplied. The storm outside had finally breached the sanctuary. Rain lashed through the shattered balcony door, spraying a cold, misty shroud over the darkened living room. The emergency lights flickered with a dying, rhythmic pulse, casting long, strobing shadows of 2 identical men who seemed to be wrestling with their own reflections. It was a brutal, primitive display of violence, A collision of two stars born from the same dark matter, now determined to extinguish one another. Nia stood paralyzed near the corridor, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Her throat throbbed where Ruin's fingers had left their mark, a physical reminder of the predator she had mistaken for her husband. The twins were gone, spirited away toward the old oak, but she was anchored here, caught in the gravity of a war she didn't fully understand. Her foot brushed against something cold and heavy on the plush carpet. She looked down. It was the tactical sidearm Ruin had dropped during the initial struggle. Without thinking, she knelt and scooped it up. The weight of the cold steel in her hands felt alien, yet strangely familiar, as if some dormant part of the London paradox, the number 7 she was supposed to be, was waking up and recognizing the tool of her trade. She raised the weapon, her hands shaking so violently the barrel traced erratic circles in the air. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the roar of the wind and the wet thud of fists. "Both of you! Stop right now!" The two men froze. They were locked in a grim embrace near the edge of the shattered glass, their silhouettes indistinguishable in the gloom. One man had his arm wrapped around the other's throat. The other had his fingers dug into a bleeding shoulder. They slowly turned their heads toward her, their faces illuminated by a sudden, jagged flash of lightning that turned the world white for a fraction of a second. They were identical, the same sharp jawline, the same wet, dark hair plastered to their foreheads, the same blood-smeared features. Even their clothes, the black silk shirts now shredded and soaked, were the same. "Nia," the man on the left said. His voice was strained, a low, gravelly rasp. "Put the gun down. It's me. I'm home. Don't listen to him," the man on the right countered, his voice an identical melodic baritone, though edged with a chillingly calm authority. "He's the ghost, Nia. He's the one who lured us into the belly. He's the one who wants to take the girls back to the old dragon." Nia stepped forward, the gun held out at arm's length. The amber lenses Ruin wore had been knocked loose or discarded in the fight. Now, both men looked at her with eyes that seemed to catch the dying light in exactly the same way. One set of eyes held a desperate, animalistic love. The other held a calculated, perfect imitation of it. "Prove it," Nia whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger. "One of you is my husband. One of you is a monster. Prove it right now." The man on the left took a staggering step forward, ignoring the blood dripping from his mangled left hand, the hand wrapped in black silk. "Nia, remember London. Remember the Hyatt. Remember room 4002. I was dying, and you were the only thing that made the world stop spinning. You saved me." The man on the right didn't flinch. He mirrored the step, his expression softening into a look of such profound, curated tenderness that it made Nia's stomach turn. "Nia, remember room 4002. The scent of the lilies, the fire alarm in the distance. I told you then that you were my miracle. I told you that as long as I breathed, the shadows wouldn't touch you. Don't let the shadow win now." Nia's head spun. They both had the memory. They both had the words. If they were truly triplets, if they had been raised and monitored as part of the same genetic project, then their memories weren't private sanctuaries, they were shared data points. The London paradox wasn't just her secret. It was their script. "The signal," Nia breathed, her eyes darting between them. "The double tap. Dune. Give me the signal." The man on the left reached out his mangled left hand, the fingers broken and swollen. He tried to mimic the motion, but his hand spasmed, the pain clearly agonizing. "Nia, I can't." The restraints in the basement. The man on the right instantly raised his left hand, perfect, unscarred, and steady. He tapped his index and middle fingers twice against his own wrist with a smooth, rhythmic precision. 1, 2. "The dragon is home, Nia, like I promised in the car." Nia looked at the steady hand of the man on the right. It was perfect. It was exactly what she had asked for. It was the correct answer. And that was how she knew he was the liar. The real Han Du-yoon was a man of jagged edges and broken pieces. He was a man who had bled for her, a man whose thumb was currently pulverized because he would rather break himself than be kept from her. The perfect version was the imitation. The perfect version was the one who didn't understand that the real Dune would never be that steady while his family was in danger. Nia shifted her aim. She didn't look at their faces. She looked at the man on the right, the one who had just given her the perfect signal. My husband is left-handed, Nia said, her voice dropping to a level of icy certainty that surprised even her. And he's a lot of things, Ruin, but he's never been perfect. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The man on the right buckled as the bullet caught him in the shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him back toward the open balcony. He let out a sharp, hissed curse. Not a cry of pain, but a sound of pure, clinical frustration. The man on the left, the real Dune, didn't wait. He lunged forward with a roar that was more animal than man. He tackled Ruin, their momentum carrying them through the shattered glass and out onto the rain-slicked balcony. Nia ran to the edge, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy. She saw them silhouetted against the lightning-streaked sky, 40 stories above the churning Han River. They were a blur of motion, two identical forms fighting for the right to exist. Dune gripped Ruin by the collar, his mangled left hand hooked like a claw into his brother's shirt. He ignored the bullet wound in his side, ignored the exhaustion screaming in his nerves. He looked into the gray eyes of his twin, the mirror that had tried to steal his soul. You were right about one thing, brother, Dune growled, his face inches from Ruin's. Biology is destiny. With a surge of strength that seemed to come from the very core of his being, Dune pivoted, using Ruin's own momentum against him. He hoisted the imposter over the railing. For a heartbeat, Ruin hung in the air, the lightning illuminating his face. There was no fear there, only a cold, vacant curiosity, as if he were simply observing the end of an experiment. See you in the next life, 1B, Dune whispered. He let go. Ruin fell silently, a dark shadow disappearing into the vertical abyss of the soul skyline. There was no splash, no sound of impact, just the endless, rhythmic drumming of the rain. Dune slumped against the railing, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He looked back into the room, where Nia was standing with the gun still clutched in her hands. He didn't try to look perfect. He didn't try to say the right words. He just looked at her with amber eyes that were tired, broken, and utterly hers. Nia dropped the weapon. She ran to him, her knees hitting the wet concrete of the balcony as she wrapped her arms around him. She didn't care about the blood, the rain, or the secrets of the Han family. She only cared about the heartbeat beneath his tattered shirt, the irregular, human rhythm of the man who had come back for her. You're late, she sobbed into his neck. Dune leaned his head against hers, his eyes closing as he felt the warmth of her body against the cold of the storm. The traffic was a nightmare. They stayed like that for a long time, two survivors clinging to each other on the edge of the world. But as the emergency lights in the penthouse finally flickered to life, Dune felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the rain. He looked toward the elevator. The doors were still open, the smoke from the breaching charge clearing. Jinho was gone, and on the floor of the hallway, directly in front of the twins' bedroom, sat a third black envelope. It hadn't been there a minute ago. Dune pulled Nia closer, his eyes scanning the shadows of the room. The brother was gone, but the sister, the ghost they called Vesper, was still in the house. And as a soft, melodic hum began to echo through the intercom system, a lullaby Nia recognized from her own childhood, the dragon realized the fight wasn't over. It had only just reached the final act. The month that followed the night on the balcony was a blur of healing, a slow-motion recovery that felt, for the first time in 6 years, like the beginning of a genuine peace. The penthouse had been scrubbed of its violence. The shattered glass was replaced with even thicker, clearer panes, and the heavy scent of ozone and copper had been traded for the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals and the twins' laughter. To the rest of Seoul, the dragon had simply weathered another internal corporate squall. To Nia, it was the victory she had prayed for in the rain-slicked streets of London. Han Dune, her Dune, was different now. He was softer, more present. He had stepped back from the jagged edges of the Choi Syndicate wars, spending his mornings teaching Isa and Arya how to paint and his evenings sitting on the terrace with Nia, his hand, the left one, still wrapped in a light surgical brace, resting protectively over hers. He spoke less of debts and more of the future. He had even started using his right hand more frequently, explaining that the trauma to his left thumb had permanently altered his dexterity. It was a logical, tragic consequence of his heroism, and Nia had accepted it with a heart full of gratitude. The police had closed the file on the intruder, who had fallen from the balcony. With no body recovered from the churning, rain-swollen Han River, the official report listed him as presumed deceased. The threat of ruin, the gray-eyed ghost, had seemingly washed away with the storm. But the silence of a house is never truly empty. It is merely waiting. On a Tuesday afternoon, while the girls were at their new private academy and the man she loved was in a board meeting downstairs, Nia decided to tackle the one room they had ignored since the move back. The reinforced storage attic. It was a space filled with the literal weight of the Han legacy. Old ledgers, antique furniture from Macau, and crates of tech equipment that predated the digital age. She was moving a stack of dusty archival boxes when her foot caught on a loose floorboard near the ventilation duct. As the wood groaned and shifted, a small, black plastic casing slid out from the gap. It was a micro SD card, its gold teeth glinting in the dim light of the attic's single bulb. Nia frowned, picking it up. It was labeled with a series of tiny, handwritten numbers. 04-02B. Curiosity, that old dangerous spark that had led her into room 4002 so many years ago, flared in her chest. She took the card down to the study, her footsteps echoing in the quiet apartment. She slid the card into the side of the heavy mahogany desk's terminal, the same desk where the black envelope had once sat, and waited for the file to mount. There was only one video file on the card. The timestamp was 30 days old. Nia pressed play. The footage was grainy, captured from a hidden, wide-angle nanny cam, tucked into the corner of the master bathroom. The date on the screen was the night of the blackout, the night of the fight. Nia watched, her breath hitching, as a man entered the frame. He was drenched, his black silk shirt clinging to his frame. He looked exhausted, his chest heaving. It was the moment after the struggle on the balcony, the moment she had been ushered into the hallway to find the girls. The man in the video didn't go to the girls. He didn't look for Nia. He walked to the bathroom sink and turned on the harsh, fluorescent vanity lights. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, vibrating tool, a professional-grade tattooing needle. Beside it, he laid out a high-resolution photograph of a hand. A left hand. Nia felt the world go cold. She leaned closer to the screen, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. In the video, the man looked into the mirror. For a fleeting second, the camera caught his eyes. They weren't amber. They were a flat, stony gray, the color of a winter sky over a graveyard. With a chilling, mechanical steadiness, the man began to work. He didn't flinch as the needle pierced his skin. He watched the photograph, then watched his own flesh, meticulously recreating the jagged, puckered scar that Han Du-yoon had carried since Macau. He traced the lines with the precision of an artist, wiping away the blood with a sterile cloth, his face a mask of absolute void-like calm. When he was finished, he took a small vial from his kit. He tilted his head back and dropped a liquid into each eye. Slowly, the gray iris began to swirl, the chemical reaction turning the stone into fire, the flat gray into a brilliant, deceptive amber. The man in the video stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and practiced a smile in the mirror. It was a warm smile, a doting smile, the smile of a man who had just saved his family. Then, he looked directly at the hidden camera, as if he knew exactly where it was, as if he had left this recording as a trophy for whoever was smart enough to find it, and mouthed 3 words, asterisk, destiny is scripted, asterisk. The video cut to black. Nia sat in the absolute silence of the study, the hum of the computer fan sounding like a scream. Her stomach churned, a violent wave of nausea washing over her. The man downstairs. The man who had tucked her daughters into bed for 30 nights. The man she had let back into her heart. Nia. The voice came from the bottom of the stairs, echoing up through the vaulted ceiling. It was that low, melodic baritone she had grown to crave. Nia's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a cry. She frantically ejected the card, shoving it into the pocket of her jeans as she stood up. She tried to steady her breathing, to find the number 7 inside her, the version of herself that could survive a predator. I'm up here, she called back, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. Just cleaning the attic dune. She walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. He was standing in the foyer, silhouetted against the bright light of the afternoon sun. He looked perfect. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, his sleeves pushed back to reveal the tattooed scar on his left hand. He held a bag of groceries in his right arm. "Dinner's almost ready," he said, looking up at her. He smiled, that small, tilted grin that had always reached his eyes. "The girls are asking for their favorite story. I told them we'd wait for you." For a split second, as the sun shifted behind a cloud and the shadows lengthened across the foyer, the light hit his face at a sharp, unforgiving angle. The amber fire in his eyes flickered. It didn't just fade. It vanished. For one heartbeat, Nia didn't see her husband. She saw the cold, stony gray of a man who had never known a miracle. She saw the ghost who had fallen from the balcony and climbed back up through the front door. The gray eyes locked onto hers, holding her gaze with a terrifying, predatory intensity. Then, as quickly as it had happened, the amber returned, warm and inviting. "Are you coming down, Nia?" he asked. His voice hadn't changed, but the question felt like a threat. Nia looked at the man at the bottom of the stairs. She thought of the twins already at the table. She thought of the real Dune, somewhere in the dark or somewhere in the river. She realized that the old oak wasn't far enough. The London paradox wasn't a memory. It was the trap she was still sitting in. She forced her feet to move. She forced her face to soften. She began to walk down the stairs, one step at a time, toward the monster who was wearing her life. "I'm coming," she whispered. The dragon thought he was the king of the board. He didn't realize that in this game, the pieces were identical, and the hand that held the pen had never stopped writing. That was a chilling cliffhanger. The tension in that attic scene was palpable. The realization that the happily ever after was actually a perfectly executed infiltration is exactly the kind of high-stakes drama your audience craves. Here is the polished conclusion to your script, incorporating the call to action and the community-building elements you requested. Nia's realization was just the beginning. She found the tape. She knows the man calling her for dinner isn't the man she loves. But she's trapped 40 stories up with a predator who wears her husband's face. Asterisk asterisk. And who is the Dune waking up in that facility in the Alps? With the triplets finally on the board, the game is about to get so much bloodier. I want to hear from you in the comments.